Welcome back for part 2 in our unit on the Progressive Era. In the first lesson, we reviewed the major problems of the time period, which we first discussed when learning about industrialization. We separated the problems into 3 distinct categories: problems caused by industrialization, immigration and urbanization, and lastly, those problems caused by political corruption. Today, we will be looking at some of the reforms that were implemented to alleviate some of those problems, but we will be specifically looking at the influence of women and minorities on these reforms. That brings us to our essential question. What influence did women and minorities have on the reforms of the Progressive Era? Let's first take a look at the impact women had on various social and political issues of the time. We've previously talked about Jane Addams and the Hull House, so we should recall that this was a settlement house founded by Miss Addams in Chicago, Illinois in 1889. Settlement houses were designed to help recently immigrated individuals and families with affordable housing and other basic necessities within a reasonable distance of factory jobs. The Hull House in particular was open to European immigrants and focused on helping women and children. In addition to the housing crisis created by immigration, another social issue of the time period involved the consumption of alcohol. There was a large group of the population that saw alcohol consumption as immoral and the cause of many of our society's problems. These people led the temperance movement, which was an organized effort during the 19th and 20th centuries to limit or outlaw the consumption and production of alcoholic beverages in the United States. This movement was led in part by Carrie Nation. Miss Nation left her first husband due to his alcoholism, which would start her on this path. The temperance movement led to the passage of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the consumption and sale of alcohol nationwide, although it would ultimately be repealed years later. Arguably, the greatest achievement of women during the Progressive Era was the fight for women's suffrage. Suffrage, while it sounds like it is related to the word suffering, is nothing of the sort. Women's suffrage is the right of women to vote, which men already maintained at this time. Up until this point in history, it was believed that women did not need a vote because their father or husband would vote on their family's behalf. However, the movement grew, calling for society to view women as their own autonomous being, separate from any men in their lives. And if they were to be seen as individuals and equal to men, they should have the right to vote based on their own beliefs. Notable women include Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul, and Lucy Burns. Susan B. Anthony, who might sound familiar, was a social reformer and women's rights activist. She co-founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association. 14 years after her death, women finally gained the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was another leading figure in women's suffrage. She was an activist and social reformer. Alice Paul helped secure the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women the right to vote. For several months, she picketed out in front of the White House. She was arrested for 7 months. Lucy Burns partnered with Alice Paul to secure the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women weren't the only people fighting for equality at this time. In fact, African Americans and other minorities faced an even steeper climb, and it would be years before their fight began to pay off. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, even after slavery was outlawed, we know that African Americans faced unequal opportunities in housing, work, education, and government policies, particularly in the South. Let's take a moment to review some of those inequalities from our Reconstruction unit. First, Plessy v. Ferguson was the Supreme Court case surrounding Homer Plessy being intentionally arrested on a white train car. He was of mixed race, and while he looked white, he was considered African American. Getting arrested was intended to help the NAACP fight separate but equal laws. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled that having separate facilities wasn't inherently unequal, and separate but equal laws were deemed to be constitutional. Second, poll taxes were intended to limit African Americans' right to vote. By charging a fee to vote, those who couldn't afford it couldn't vote. While this did impact some poor white men, it largely impacted the African American community as intended. Lastly, Jim Crow laws flourished throughout the South. These were laws enforcing racial segregation and discrimination, preventing African Americans from being seen as equals. They could not share the same resources and public facilities with white people. Two men leading the charge for racial equality were W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. While these two men were fighting the same fight, they had very different political approaches and were viewed very differently by the African American community. On the one hand, Du Bois was very outspoken. He wanted full political, civil, and social rights for all black people, and he wanted it immediately. He was not opposed to being loud and actively fighting against unjust policy and treatment. Du Bois worked closely with the NAACP and was seen very positively by the African American community. Washington, on the other hand, argued for a much slower and less combative approach. He believed in creating equality through education. He accepted social segregation for the time being and founded the Tuskegee Institute for Black people and other minorities to get an education. He believed that equality could be achieved through vocational education and accepted social segregation while quietly working against discriminatory laws. For many African Americans in his community, this did not feel like a fast enough and appropriate enough approach. As mentioned in the previous slide, the NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was founded to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality for African Americans. Ida B. Wells Barnett was one of the founders of the NAACP. She was an African American investigative journalist, educator, and an early leader in the civil rights movement. She was known for fighting against lynching and the many other injustices suffered by African Americans by publicizing the lynchings in newspaper articles and other writings for people to see. All right, go ahead and take a moment to reflect on today's essential question. What influence did women and minorities have on the reforms of the progressive era? You should be able to come up with more than a few.